Hey everybody, Ian here. In my last video, I left off at the tail end of the Democratic Party's generation-long trek through the political wilderness. And so I'm just going to pick up right where I left off then. But so in the lead up to the 1992 presidential election, Bush 41 seemed like a sure thing to win. And so no prominent Democrats at the time wanted to run against him and be remembered as a loser. In the vein of, George McGovern and Walter Mondale and Michael Dukakis. But so Bill Clinton, the young, relaxed Democratic governor of Arkansas, he threw his name into the ring as somewhat of a dark horse candidate. And then due to a combination of his youth, his intelligence, his warmth and charisma as a speaker, and most importantly, his moderate leanings, he ended up winning the Democratic nomination and ultimately won the election, becoming the first Democrat in a generation to win the White House. As you can see, he made many inroads all across the country. He won states that hadn't been won by Democrats in decades, and he brought the margin of losses down to less than 5% in conservative strongholds like Texas and even Kansas. Kansas, that's my home state. Represent. But so even though Bush 41 had seemed like such a sure thing, just 18 months before the election, he turned out to be on far less stable ground than most people realized. Part of this was due to there was an economic downturn in the early 1990s while Bush 41 was president, and this exacerbated the already existing problem of the budget deficit and the debt. I mentioned in my last video that while Reagan was president, the debt and the deficit began to grow pretty substantially, enough so that by the time the 1992 election rolled around, they were viewed as huge issues by many voters of both parties. The budget deficit was actually one of the top issues of the 1992 election, one of the top three issues. And Bush 41, he did some damage to himself because in 1988, while he was running for election the first time, he made a very famous pledge at the Republican convention. He said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But then in an effort to close the widening budget deficit, the difference between the money we make and the money we spend, he ended up raising taxes. And this made a lot of voters really mad because it annoyed a lot of voters, I guess, because he walked back on this promise. And it made a lot of Republican voters really mad because he raised taxes. And Ronald Reagan, who was his predecessor, Bush 41 had been Reagan's vice president. Reagan's entire school of economic thought was centered around low taxes. So in addition to this, the economic downturn and the growing debt and deficit and walking back this famous pledge of his, he was also just viewed as out of touch by a lot of I was starting to say grocery stores, by a lot of voters, particularly when compared to the far more personable Bill Clinton. And like I mentioned in my previous video 4, Bush 41 just did not have the charisma of Ronald Reagan. And so he went on to lose the 1992 election. He's one of relatively few incumbent presidents to lose re-election. But there was also a guy named Ross Perot who ran in 1992 and in 1996 as a third-party candidate. And he actually ended up getting about 20% of the vote in 1992, which is very impressive for a third-party candidate. He doesn't show up on these maps, though, because he didn't win any states' electoral votes. But he's important to remember, partly because, for reasons that I will explain in a later video, probably video 8, he could very much be viewed as a prelude to Donald Trump, who is president right now, in case you haven't noticed. I don't know how you would miss that, but but Ross Perot, he was a very interesting person with views that were just kind of all over the place. And at the time, he was viewed as an oddball by a lot of people, partly because of the nature of his personality. He was just kind of wacky, I guess, but also just his actual views themselves. There's a funny line about him from a season 5 episode of The Simpsons. This episode aired in 1994, so just after he had run in 1992. And I'll just show this little clip of the episode.
Mart, please, old people don't need companionship. They need to be isolated and studied so it can be determined what nutrients they have that might be extracted for our personal use.
Homer, would you please stop reading that Ross Perot pamphlet?
Oh!
Oh my gosh. I love The Simpsons. I love The Simpsons so much. That's actually my favorite show. But I'm going to talk more about. Well, okay, the first 10 seasons is my favorite show. But I'm going to talk more about this. Okay, and really seasons 3 through 9, that's my favorite show. But I'm going to talk more about The Simpsons in greater detail in video 7, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, back to Ross Perot, the topic at hand. I go on lots of tangents in case you somehow also haven't noticed that, in case you've been living on Mars in a cave with your eyes shut and your fingers in your ears. But there's some debate over whether or not Ross Perot spoiled the election for Bush 41. Some people think that had Perot not been in the race, Bush 41 would have been reelected. And I think they base this on the fact that Bill Clinton only got 42% of the popular vote in 1992, which seems very low. And it is pretty low by historical standards. But remember that there was a candidate, third-party candidate, getting 20% of the vote nationwide in this race. So Bill Clinton winning with a 42% plurality should not be particularly surprising. But the thing is, Bush 41 was very unpopular going into the 92 race. His favorable ratings were in like the 30s. And so him getting reelected would have hinged on like 2/3 of the people who voted for Perot voting for Bush 41, which I just find highly unlikely. I find it hard to suspend disbelief far enough to see Bill Clinton only getting 1/3 of Perot's supporters. But so personally, I do think that Bill Clinton would have won the election regardless of Ross Perot's presence. His margin of victory might have changed, and some of the states that he won might have stayed Republican. But I do think that he would have won because Bush was like I said, pretty unpopular, and the Republicans had already won 3 elections in a row. That's already very hard to do. 4 elections in a row is virtually unheard of. Virtually. But so Bill Clinton ran for re-election in 1996, and he won by a healthy margin, a larger margin than he had in 1992. And around this time, the economy began to take off. I mentioned earlier that the economy took a downturn in the early 90s. And I also mentioned, I explained the budget deficit and the debt, the difference between those two things in my last video 4. And I mentioned in the early part of this video that they had been a very big issue going into the 92 election, along with the economy. But by the late 1990s, the economy was doing very, very well, although it was on shaky foundation, but that wasn't known at the time. And the U.S. was actually running balanced budgets in the late 90s. We had budget surpluses. We were taking in more money in tax revenues than we were spending. And this was due to a combination of tax increases in the early 1990s by both Bush 41 and Bill Clinton, and a decrease in military spending following the end of the Cold War. Although despite this decrease, defense spending was still unprecedentedly high in the 1990s, given the fact that the U.S. was not engaged in any wars at the time. The Cold War ended in 1989, and 9/11, which triggered the invasion of Afghanistan, didn't happen until 2001. And so we had, like I said, unprecedentedly high peacetime military spending. But the military-industrial complex is a separate conversation that needs to be had on another day because, as its name implies, it is complex. But back to the budget surpluses, though. These surpluses, these balanced budgets, which had sprung forth from reduced defense spending and increased tax revenues, interestingly disappeared in the year 2002 when military spending was increased and taxes were once again slashed, particularly on the richest Americans. But so in the year 2000, Bill Clinton's Vice President Al Gore ran against George W. Bush, who we will call Bush 43, because he won that election in 2000 and became the 43rd president. I don't know what was I saying 33rd? I don't. But anyway, one thing that's interesting about the 2000 election to me is how close it was. A lot of people know about Florida, and in case you don't know, that's fine. Don't worry, you're just really stupid. But so out of the 5.9 million votes cast in the state of Florida in 2000, Bush won the state by 537 votes. That's a margin of 0.009%. And Florida, it famously took weeks to get its final vote tally in. And so after the 2000 election, we didn't know for like a month who had won the election. But regardless of who would end up winning, that election was going to be really, really close. You need 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. And the final score was that Al Gore got 266 to George Bush's 271. And so it was very, very close. And in fact, Al Gore lost the state of New Hampshire. That's the only time in the 7 elections between 1992 and 2016. That's the only time a Democrat has lost New Hampshire. But Al Gore lost New Hampshire by 1%. And New Hampshire has 4 electoral votes. And so if he had done 1% better in New Hampshire, if he had just won that state, he would have gotten exactly 270 electoral votes. And so Florida, famous Florida, wouldn't have even mattered. There's some debate, though, over whether or not Al Gore distancing himself from Bill Clinton during the 2000 campaign, which he very much did. There's debate over whether or not that hurt his chances that year. A lot of people think that hurt Al Gore in that election. And I think people base this opinion on the fact that in the year 2000, in the lead up to the 2000 election, Bill Clinton had a 65 to 70% job approval rating. 2/3 of Americans approved of the way Bill Clinton was doing his job as president. And so at first glance, it does seem odd that the incumbent vice president would choose to distance himself from the broadly popular incumbent president, counterproductive even. However, the thing is that even though Clinton's job approval rating was, 65%, his personal approval rating, which is when they ask, regardless of how you think he does at his job, what do you think of the president personally? His personal approval rating was like 30%. And so in the late 1990s, there was this 35% chunk of Americans who approved of the job Bill Clinton was doing as president, but did not approve of the way he conducted his personal life. And that kind of thing doesn't really happen anymore. Nowadays, the people who approve of the president's job performance approve of him personally. And the people who disapprove of him personally disapprove of his job performance. Opinions are a lot more set in stone than they used to be. But so Bush 43, he took advantage of this approval gap. Because remember, the economy at the time was really good, even though it was on shaky foundation. The tech bubble was a phenomenon in the 1990s. There were lots of new emerging tech companies that were selling stocks that were at vastly overinflated prices, and then eventually it all just burst and it came crashing down. But so the economy at the time in the late 90s was doing really well. The bubble didn't burst until 2001-ish. So there were budget surpluses, there were record job increases, and there was a soaring stock market, which at the time was a far better indicator of the state of the economy than it is today. The stock market is in no way a good economic indicator anymore. Exhibit A would just be the soaring stock numbers in the face of tens of millions of Americans being out of a job because of the coronavirus pandemic. But so in the year 2000, there was nothing to run against in the area of the economy. And so Bush 43 ran a campaign based on morals. He ran a campaign based on restoring decency to the White House. And this resonated with a lot of socially conservative Southerners in states that had voted for Clinton in 92 and 96. And I think that this approach worked because a number of Southern states voted for Bush by a small margin. There's a lot of light pink in the 2000 margin map. But then in 2001, just under 8 months into Bush 43's presidency, 9/11 happened. And it's impossible to overstate how much things changed and how many things changed after 9/11. The 90s, particularly the late 1990s, had been a time of broad optimism in America, even though there were definitely still problems at the time. I'm going to talk more in detail about the 90s in general and how interesting of a window in time they were in video 10, though. And I'll talk more about the impact of 9/11 when I discuss U.S. foreign policy, just because it is a huge turning point for the U.S. But following 9/11, Bush 43's approval rating skyrocketed up to 90%. 9 out of every 10 Americans approved of the way Bush 43 was doing his job in October of 2001. And this was a rally around the flag effect. There was an attack on America, and so everyone supports the president. But so following 9/11, Bush 43 launched what's called the War on Terror, which the specifics to which are again a separate conversation that need to be had, along with the military-industrial complex and just U.S. foreign policy in general. But this War on Terror, it involved the invasion of Afghanistan in October of 2001, which was just a month after 9/11. And so this had pretty broad support among Americans because, like I said, this was just 1 month after 9/11. And there was reason to believe that many of the perpetrators of 9/11 were residing somewhere in Afghanistan. They were hiding there. But the War on Terror also involved the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was much more controversial and remains more controversial because Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And don't get me wrong, Saddam Hussein was a horrible, horrible person. He was a dictator, and he used chemical weapons to kill millions of Iraqi citizens. But again, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And further, invading the country and toppling the existing government without a clear exit strategy, and I mean really without any exit strategy, left an enormous vacuum of power in an already destabilized region. And so we are very much still dealing with the after effects of this absurdly stupid decision today. But again, U.S. foreign policy and the military-industrial complex are part of a separate conversation that needs to be had. I'll likely discuss this in video 14, so once again, stay tuned. But the Iraq War continued to be a major issue in the next several presidential elections. But so in 2004, Democrats nominated a moderate guy named John Kerry, who they very much hoped that he would be able to beat Bush 43. Because even though Bush's job approval rating it had spiked to 90% following 9/11, it gradually worked its way down to about 50%, give or take a few points, in the lead up to 2004. Bush ultimately prevailed, though, although by a pretty small margin, although it was not as small as it had been in 2000 when he lost the popular vote in 2000 by about 500,000 votes nationwide. The reason he was able to win was because he won the state of Florida by 537 votes. 2000 was a very messy election, and it's relatively forgotten. People don't talk much about it just because other recent elections have been so messy. But anyway, a fun little piece of trivia about the 2004 election, though, is that at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, the keynote speaker was a then relatively unknown Barack Obama, who gave a very good speech. I've actually watched it before. I've watched it a couple times. And it's very captivating. He's so charismatic and passionate and convincing that you forget that this isn't his convention until the few times that he mentions John Kerry's name, and it kind of like snaps you back into reality. You're like, oh yeah, this is John Kerry's convention. Obama's not running for president yet. But John Kerry, being the relatively forgettable guy that he is, he went on to lose the 2004 election, like I mentioned earlier. You can see, though, on that 2004 margin map that the number of dark-colored states is increasing, particularly for the Republican side. Part of this is because the conservative Republicans were still very much unified behind the Iraq War, which had begun just a year earlier at this point. But also social issues played a role in the 2004 election, particularly gay marriage, which was used as a wedge issue by the Republican Party. But regardless of that, though, the 2004 election was one that largely was dominated by foreign policy, and voters just trusted Bush 43 more on this issue, as he had been president during 9/11, and the Iraq War had not evolved into and I guess really devolved into the complete clusterfuck that it would become just a couple years later. But there had actually been a guy named Howard Dean who was very liberal, who ran for the Democratic nomination in 2004, but lost to the more moderate John Kerry. Howard Dean is interesting because even though he didn't really come that close to winning the nomination in 2004, he showed that there was a growing interest in progressivism within the Democratic Party. He favored universal government health care, and he was staunchly opposed to the war in Iraq, which had begun just a year earlier in 2003. And even though he lost the nomination in 2004, it could be argued that to a certain extent, his candidacy helped pave the way for Barack Obama's candidacy in 2008, because he was the more liberal of him and Hillary in the 2008 Democratic primary. And it ultimately paved the way for Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, even though he was ultimately unsuccessful in those races. But so in 2008, Democrats were very eager to replace Bush 43 in the White House, and they had a very crowded field of candidates run. Not as crowded, though, as the Republicans in 2016 or as the Democrats in 2020, both of which were just way too, oh my gosh, too many cooks in the kitchen. But in the lead up to the 2008 campaign, it was widely expected that Hillary Clinton, Senator Hillary Clinton at the time, Senator of New York, would become the Democratic nominee, and it seemed likely that she would probably win the presidency as well. However, Barack Obama, who had made a name for himself back in 2004, giving the keynote speech at the Democratic convention, he ended up swooping in and winning the nomination out from under her. And he raised major campaign funds through the use of online fundraising, which was a very new concept at the time. Hillary Clinton didn't capitalize on it early enough because, Obama's a lot younger than her and understood the dynamics and the power of the internet, I think, to a greater extent than she did. But these record funds that he was raising allowed him to invest very heavily in the early primary states, particularly Iowa. He won the Iowa caucus. And in fact, Hillary Clinton came in a rather embarrassing for her third place in the Iowa caucus. But she had support from most black voters at the time, black Democratic voters, because even though they knew about Barack Obama, they were unsure about whether or not a black candidate could go places. But then once he won Iowa, a very predominantly white state, black voters abandoned Hillary Clinton in droves to support Barack Obama. But the 2008 convention, it ended up being an extended match between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and I don't have much time to go into any more detail about it, which is a shame because it is very interesting. Perhaps in a future video, video 8 maybe. But so in the lead up to the 2008 election, Bush 43 was becoming more and more unpopular every single day. Like I mentioned earlier, the 2003 Iraq War was turning out to be just a massive clusterfuck. And in addition to this, the economy entered a recession in early 2008, which became a fully fledged financial crisis in the fall of 2008, when the permanent closure, the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers, which was a huge U.S. bank, and one of many banks in the U.S. that had been dealing out risky, high-interest mortgages to clients who had no realistic way of ever being able to repay these loans, basically trapping millions of American families into massive amounts of ever-growing high-interest housing debt that they would never be able to repay. But the closure of this bank, the Lehman Brothers, caused the U.S.'s rapidly growing housing bubble, similar to the tech bubble of the late 90s. It caused the U.S.'s rapidly growing housing bubble to burst, which triggered a global financial meltdown. And this economic crisis, like I mentioned, it began in the fall of 2008, just months before the election. And so Obama ended up winning the 2008 election by a large margin. It was not by by Reagan 84 margins, but it was by Bill Clinton margin. Very, very safe healthy, robust margin. And he ran on a message of hope and change. And he did very well, including in a number of conservative states. And it seemed like the trend of polarization that had begun in the 1990s was beginning to pull back. And it was also a huge deal that he was black. It was insane, and still is insane, that a black man could be elected president just a few generations removed from slavery. Because remember, as I mentioned in video 2, 1860 was not that long ago. The Civil War and the era of slavery in America was not that long ago. But so even though things were very bleak at the time, for Americans, the economy was in shambles, and there were multiple wars going on that were just going terribly, and healthcare costs were skyrocketing, and there were massive amounts of political polarization and hostility between the two parties. The candidacy and election of Obama were viewed as very inspiring through the eyes of millions of Americans, and like I said, even some conservative Republicans. Because remember, he ran on a message of hope and change, which really truly resonated with Americans. That's part of why he was able to defeat the more establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton, in the primaries, because people were so fed up with the system. It mirrors 2016 in a number of ways, and even 2020. But so when Obama was elected in 2008, it really truly seemed like things were going to change. And really, a lot of things did change while Obama was president, but just not enough things changed, and the things that did change didn't do so by big enough margins. But a lot of groundwork, a lot of foundation was laid for large, revolutionary Bernie Sanders style changes that will likely come in the future. It's kind of like when a building is being built. For a long time, it's just a hole in the ground. But really important framework stuff, foundational stuff is happening below the surface. And then before you know it, 10 stories just spring out of that from that hole in the ground, and then 25, then 50, then 75 stories and an observation deck, all from that hole in the ground where they spent a really long time building the foundation for what would eventually become that skyscraper. I'm going to dive more into the specifics of the Democratic Party's policy positions of the Obama and Bill Clinton administrations during video 8, though. Because the ongoing transformation of the Democratic Party over the last 3 decades is a separate conversation that needs to be had. Obama was reelected in 2012, though, by a solid margin. But he actually became the first president ever to be reelected by a smaller popular vote margin and a smaller electoral college margin than he had been the first time. And at this point in 2012, the polarization between the two parties got back on track, following what was ultimately just a blip in 2008. If you can look at the darkness of the 2012 margin map and compare that to 1992 and 96. And it's interesting because even though the 92 and 96 elections were actually decided by larger margins of victory between the two candidates, the 2012 map has far more states in the darkest shades. There were more states being decided by double-digit margins. Excuse me, my butt kind of hurts. But so after 2012, Obama became what's known as a lame duck president because he couldn't run for re-election in 2016. And Washington just continued to be a complete mess for years. And this mess, along with the American people's widespread dissatisfaction with said mess, led into the 2016 election, which I will talk about in video 8, because as I'm sure everyone is aware, that there is a lot to talk about regarding 2016. For now, though, at 29 minutes, I'm sorry. For now, though, I'm going to jump back to 1992, and I'm going to talk about Congress. For decades before 1992, pretty much ever since the end of World War II, Congress had been very steadily Democratic, even though Republican presidents kept getting elected. Part of this may have been a causal relationship, as it's common for the party that doesn't control the White House to have more seats in Congress. But a big part of the steady congressional Democratic majorities, though, was the presence of conservative Southern Democrats, both in terms of elected officials and the voters themselves. Through the 1960s and the 70s, though, as the Democratic Party moved to the left on social issues, such as race, which I discussed in video 2, as well as abortion and the environment and LGBT rights. The Southern white conservative former Democrats began voting for Republicans at the presidential level, but kept voting for these conservative Southern Democrats at the congressional level. And this is called ticket splitting. It's when voters, they split their ticket between, a Republican president and a Democratic representative. And ticket splitting is far less common now than it used to be. I think it's at like historic lows right now. People are they vote Republican all the way down the ticket or Democrat all the way down the ticket. But it wasn't until 1994, though, when this shifted among these conservative voters with what's called the Republican Revolution. Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, and then in 1994, his first midterm elections, the Republican Party made sweeping historic gains, allowing them to win back both the House of Representatives and the Senate for the first time since the early 1950s. Even though Republicans, like I said, they had been doing pretty well at the presidential level during that time, the party had been completely shut out of Congress. The reason for the shift in 1994, I think, was twofold. First, like I said, it's common for the party that does not control Congress, or that does not control the White House, to gain seats in Congress. Second, though, and I think more importantly, the Southern white conservative Democrat was disappearing. There were people who had grown up voting for presidential candidates like FDR and Harry Truman in the 30s and the 40s, who still felt a very real sense of allegiance to the Democratic Party, even though they had been voting Republican for president for at least 20 years. But this generation kids, though, they didn't have that same experience. They couldn't look back fondly upon the days of FDR and Harry Truman, since they weren't born for another 20 or so years after that. They grew up in an era where the Democratic Party did not meet their desires and never had. And so once this group of voters, these younger conservative white Southerners whose parents had always been Democratic, once this group of Americans began voting more regularly, they said to themselves, like, hey, it doesn't really make sense to be voting for Democrats for Congress. That party has always been full of crazy liberals, going all the way back to my birth in 1967. And having Democrats control the White House and Congress for the first time in their adult lives helped them realize that. And so in 1994, these voters switched allegiances, and Republicans gained like 50 seats in Congress and several Senate seats, allowing them to take back both chambers of Congress for the first time in over 40 years. And Democrats, they wouldn't take back the White House until 2006. They wouldn't take back the House of Representatives until 2006 or the Senate until 2008. But the path there is pretty interesting. As interesting as a discussion about partisan control of the legislative branch can be. But in the 1996 elections, Bill Clinton, he was reelected by a wider margin than he had been in 1992, and Democrats gained seats in Congress, but not enough to put them back into the majority. The 1998 midterms are where things get particularly interesting, though, and again, as interesting as legislative branch discussions can be. But in 1998, Bill Clinton was in the middle of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and he had been impeached in 98 by the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, but he was acquitted by the Republican-controlled Senate and was not removed from office. But so in 1998, the 1998 midterms, Democrats they gained seats in Congress, which was very, very rare. It's only ever happened 3 times in the last 100 years that the party that controls the White House gained seats in a midterm elections. It happened in 2002, I'll get to that in a minute, in 1998, and in 1934 at the height of the Great Depression and FDR's massive popularity. But the reason Democrats gained seats in 1998 was because of how voters perceived Bill Clinton's impeachment. Bill Clinton was impeached because he committed perjury. He lied under oath, which is a felony. But the lie he told was that he didn't cheat on his wife. And so voters viewed this as the Republican Party overstepping and just being out to get Bill Clinton. I call him Bill Clit in my notes. But anyway, and so The Democrats won seats in 1998, but again, it wasn't enough to take back the majority of either chamber. But it did send a message to Republicans in Congress, and the Speaker of the House at the time, Newt Gingrich, he actually resigned as Speaker following that election because his tenure was seen as not okay by American voters. And then Democrats, they gained a few seats in the 2000 election because remember, Al Gore won the popular vote that year. And then at this point, seats in Congress were almost evenly divided in the House of Representatives, which is very rare. Historically, one party or the other has had a 25 to 30 seat majority in the House of Representatives. But at this point, it was split almost evenly down the middle in the House and perfectly evenly in the Senate. It was a 50-50 split. And this makes sense because you need to remember that the 2000 presidential election was going to be super, super close, regardless of who won. But then in September 2001, less than 8 months into Bush 43's presidency, 9/11 happened, which, like I mentioned earlier, changed everything. And then so Democrats lost seats in the 2002 midterms, which, like I mentioned, is very rare. The only other times that happened in the last 100 years were in 98 and in 1934. The reason that Democrats lost seats in 2002, despite not controlling the White House, was the impact of 9/11. The Republican Party had control of the White House, and there had been this rally around the flag effect following 9/11, and so Bush 43, who at the time had like a 70-ish% approval rating, it had gone down since the immediate aftermath of 9/11, but voters wanted him to have solid congressional majorities. The Democrats ended up taking back the House of Representatives in 2006 because of the growing unpopularity of the ongoing Iraq War, as well as Bush 43's sinking popularity rating and several late in the game corruption scandals involving high-profile Republican congressmen that came into light in the lead up to the 2006 election. And then so, the Democrats won back the House in 2006, and then in 2008, they won back the White House and the Senate. And so similarly to 1992 to 94, Democrats controlled the White House as well as both chambers of Congress. And then, similarly to the 94 Republican wave, there was a massive Republican wave in the 2010 midterms. It was the rise of the Tea Party. And this was a wave of very, very conservative Republicans who ran against Democrats and even incumbent Republicans and were elected into Congress on a wave of anti-Obama sentiment. And it really was a wave. Republicans they gained 63 seats in the House of Representatives in 2010. Which erased all the gains Democrats had made in recent elections. And so the Republicans took back the House of Representatives for the first time since 2006. Oh, something's vibrating. I got a text. Oh my gosh. It's just from Verizon. Apparently I have to pay my bills. That doesn't sound right. But so, like I said, the Republicans took back the House of Representatives in 2006, and they controlled the House for the rest of Obama's presidency. And even though Democrats were able to keep the Senate in the 2010 Tea Party revolution, they lost the Senate in 2014 to the Republicans. Obama had been reelected in 2012, and so 2014 was his second midterm elections. And like I said, it's historically very common for the party that doesn't control the White House to gain seats in Congress. Democrats, they gained seats in the 2016 elections, but they wouldn't in the House in the 2016 elections, but they wouldn't actually win back the House until 2018, which was Trump's first midterm elections. And that was, similar to the 2010 Tea Party wave or the 1994 Republican Revolution. This was a Democratic wave in 2018. But though even though Democrats gained, they really swept the House in 2018. Republicans actually gained seats in the Senate just because of the map that year. The way that the Senate works is that there are 100 senators. There's 2 for every state. And 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. And so each individual senator runs for re-election every 6 years. They serve 6-year terms. And in 2018, Democrats were defending twice as many seats as Republicans were, with a bunch of Democrats up for re-election in states that Trump had won by double-digit margins in 2016. And so even though Republicans did gain in the Senate that in 2018, they actually underperformed given how favorable the map was to them. But this is of relatively little importance because the bottom line is that Republicans gained seats in the Senate in 2018. But I'm going to talk more about the Democrats in the Trump era in video 8, though. Oh my gosh, 40 minutes in. Shit, okay. I'm going to take a step back, though, before I finish. I'm sure to a lot of people, the concept of red states and blue states is very familiar. You know, there's the states that always go blue for Democrats and the states that always vote red for Republicans, and the swing states that change from election to election. But that nomenclature, you know, the red states versus blue states, that didn't become a thing until as recently as the 2000 election, which is, it seems crazy, just given how firmly set in place so many states are today. But the reason it took until 2000 was because the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, they were very turbulent times in terms of electoral politics. You know, there were states that had voted Democratic for the previous 100 years that were suddenly voting Republican almost all the time, but not all the time. They were switching back and forth, and it was by varying degrees, sometimes by 2%, sometimes by 20%. And there were all these other states that were constantly switching back and forth between the two parties, between every election. And there were third-party candidates getting electoral votes, or even if they weren't getting electoral votes, they were getting 20% of the vote nationwide. And at various points, there were massive 45-plus state landslides in both directions for both parties. And so because of how dynamic the election results were being from the 60s through the 90s, it wasn't a given how each state would vote. But as the 1990s were on and Bill Clinton reached, I think, the point of diminishing returns in terms of Southern inroads reached, it became clear that a large collection of states were simply always going to vote Democratic, and a large collection of other states were just always going to vote Republican. And this coincided with a sharp increase in partisanship and polarization that began in the 1990s while Bill Clinton was president, and has continued virtually uninterrupted to this day. I think a lot of people have mixed feelings about Bill Clinton now. A lot of older Democrats have very fond memories of him because, you know, like I mentioned earlier, he was seriously the first Democrat in a generation to win the White House at all. The Democrats were coming off 25 years of landslide losses, and so it was really invigorating for people like my mom and my dad and my grandma, you know, who are all Democrats, to finally see a Democrat decisively win the White House and then keep it 4 years later. And plus, he was young. Bill Clinton was the first baby boomer president. And I realized that baby boomers are not exactly in fashion right now. But remember that in 1992, boomers were a very young generation. You know, Reagan was 77 when he left office, and Bush 41 was 68 when he left office in 1992. And so when Bill Clinton came onto the scene at age 46, he was like a breath of fresh air. You know, he was young, and he was cool, and he was charismatic, and he played the saxophone, and like I said earlier, he won. And then the latter half of his administration was marked by a booming economy, which didn't begin to falter until after he had left office. But you know, there were record job gains, and the last 4 budgets that he passed as president all ran record surpluses. And so he was the first success story for the Democratic Party in ages. You know, the last Democrat before him had been Jimmy Carter, who had been so unsuccessful as president that Republicans used him as a boogeyman for the next 20 years. They would say, you know, like, hey, vote Republican. Remember how bad Jimmy Carter was? You need to vote for us. And by the way, I think a similar thing is going to happen with the Republican Party and Trump. But that's neither here nor there. And you know, the last Democrat before Jimmy Carter was Lyndon Johnson, who had been so unpopular that he didn't even run for a second term. And the Democrat before that was JFK, who had been killed before he was even able to fully accomplish anything. And so again, Bill Clinton, he was the first Democratic success story in over 40 years. On the other hand, though, his legislative record, which I think a lot of younger people who weren't old enough or maybe weren't even alive to experience Bill Clinton's presidency, his legislative record is less impressive. Sure, the economy was great when he left office, and a lot of voters associate the economy with the president. But the reality is that the president has very little direct impact on the state of the economy. And for voters born in 2001, because people born in 2001 are 19 right now, for voters born in 2001, it doesn't really matter to them that the economy was really good 2 years before they were born. And so now that the politics of that era have passed, what remains is his legislative record, which is a relatively mixed bag. There are some good things, but there's also some bad things. Like I said earlier, though, I'm going to talk more about the specifics of the Democratic Party's policies under the Clinton and the Obama administrations in video 8. So once again, stay tuned. This bitter polarization between parties, though, as well as the partisanship among voters that we see today, it first began to show its head in the 1990s, which is it's kind of funny for me to think about in 2020, just because it's like, oh my gosh, you sweet little naive 90s voters and commentators, you have no idea what's coming in terms of political hostility. The thing about all this polarization, though, is that it's changed a lot while at the same time changing very little. Americans have always disagreed on lots and lots of issues, and really on a lot of the same issues that we're still disagreeing on. But the thing is that those issues never really fell all that neatly onto party lines until relatively recently. There used to be a lot of liberal Northern Republicans and a lot of conservative Southern Democrats. And so there used to be a lot more overlap between the two parties than there is today. Nowadays, virtually all the liberals are Democrats and all the conservatives are Republicans. And so the subject of our disagreements hasn't changed that much. But what has changed has been the boundaries of our parties. We as a people have stayed relatively in the same place as we've always been, but the parties around us have shifted, which has changed our perspective, but not our views. But over the course of the 1990s through the mid-2010s, the world of politics just seemed to be getting crazier and crazier every single day. Bitterness and polarization, they were reaching record levels, and we were entering into uncharted territory in terms of partisanship and congressional gridlock and economic frustration. Amidst all this chaos, though, there was also a sense of steadiness. It was predictable how each state would vote, and what policies each party would support, and how each group of voters would align themselves. But this sense of steadiness began to take a nosedive, though, on the afternoon of June 16th, 2015, with the candidacy of a guy named Donald Trump, who I will talk about in video 8. So thank you very much to those of you who stuck around after, 48 minutes. I know this was very long. I hope that you learned at least one new thing with this video. My goal is for the pieces of today's political puzzle to be starting to fall into place now. Hopefully the tapestry of bullshit that is our political system is starting to come into view. But so anyway, thank you very much for watching, and have a great night.